Hi, hello everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, and welcome to the Public Space Academy. This is Luisa Bravo, the founder and the director of the Public Space Academy. And we are here today for our monthly keynote lecture. We had some technical issues, but I hope you can find the link, especially on LinkedIn, to follow this live event. It will be recorded anyway, and so you can also watch it later. Now, I would like to introduce you Via Viese, who is a member of the team of the Public Space Academy. Hi, Via.
Hi, hello everyone. Welcome as usual to our monthly lectures, and we hope that we haven't lost too many of you along the way with our technical difficulties.
Yes, we sometimes have some technical issues, but hopefully now everything is fixed. So we will have Via, as usual, moderating the Q&A session, and so we will meet later, Via. So now I would like to introduce you our keynote lecture. We are very glad to have today with us Kathryn Ewing, who is a senior advisor on public space for city space architecture. And she's also a professional architect, urban designer, and urban planner in Southern Africa. She's a senior lecturer in urban design at the School of Architecture, Planning and Geomatics at the University of Cape Town. And her lecture today will be on spaces of exchange. Welcome, Kathryn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here today. So thank you for the invitation, and it's such a great initiative, the Public Space Academy. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn, for being with us. And now I give you the floor, and we will meet again later for the Q&A.
Thanks, Louisa. And good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. So I am going to be giving a lecture today on spaces of exchange, perspectives of soft infrastructure at the urban periphery of Southern African cities. But before we begin, I just thought I would just quickly explain who I am. I have 25 years of research, teaching, and practice of, in, for, and with public space in Southern Africa. I'm an architect, urban designer, planner, and an educator. These are the spaces in which I find myself and I locate myself, often on the edge or in marginal spaces. However, in our Southern African context, the myriad of urban space configurations experience varying levels of publicness. For example, the Lotus River Canal in Gugulethu, which is a core green space running through a township environment on the Cape Flats, but yet it's not quite as green as it should be. On the other side, we have creative spaces, yet incomplete, self-constructed, almost fractional spaces that support a multitude of activities and functions. These often act as spatial landmarks and makeshift everyday places. As a Gugulethu resident said, these are our places of everyday culture. They may be grey spaces, and they may need some green spaces within that, but they hold a certain energy in these environments as public space. However, many of these spaces are neglected, dangerous, and undetermined. And these are the spaces in which crime becomes such a huge problem in many of the South African context. So I looked at public space in two ways, the first being the foreground space and the second being the background space. The foreground space may be, as well as we know it, as public space, where we understand these overground frameworks, tangible spaces such as playgrounds, parks, sports fields. They may be determined, zoned, even controlled. They sometimes have formal solutions, mainly have formal solutions, and they use certain technology or AI to facilitate the maintenance of them. They also are associated with budgets and maintenance plans. However, these are part of a long-term change and transformation. On the other side, we have space that is public, but not necessarily determined or zoned as public space. These are examples of intangible systems. They are everyday commons. They are temporary. They change by day and by night. They are also spaces of experimentation and, importantly, spaces of co-design. They find innovation and inventiveness. I consider these as underground networks. They're transitory, and most importantly, they're incremental. The clash of the two sometimes comes together in environments that are often on the periphery of the cities. So with that in mind, the two key things that I look for is the first being access, because that determines the safety, and the second being the exposure, which understands vulnerability. So I often land off-grid in the spaces in which I work, and these are the spaces that I feel are peripheral territories, both in geography and political spaces. They are incomplete fractional spaces, and they often are spatial occupation for livelihood production and survival. This is an example. The image shows an area in Namibia, in Windhoek, called Peter Nanyemba, and it's this very dynamic, active, vibrant street that is all around economy. So this lands us at the intersection of something to do with the ordinary and the extraordinary, as Harrison and Zach call it. So it's a complex patterning of the socio-spatial change after apartheid. But they are also everyday post-colonial urban spaces. And these are the spaces that require assistance in terms of guiding them mainly around safety issues and exposure. So it leads me to a reframing of Southern public spaces, and most importantly, asking the question of what is the role of peripheral soft infrastructure in Southern African cities? Is public space considered an infrastructure? And what exactly do I mean by soft? Often these public spaces are spaces that experience livelihood. They have home-based enterprise, spaza shops, tuck shops, shebeens, hair salons. But this builds on local knowledge and questions the gathering of spaces. They also land themselves within water and food security, so being around water points, community, and also home or individual gardens, where this explores the idea of land and space for everyday production. The third one is around education and early childhood development centres, or child spaces, reviving the focus of community in the neighbourhood. And lastly, public space around safe walkways and waterways. So this shifts the idea of the co-production of micro public spaces. And here forms the intersectionality of public spaces where these four elements come together. I will give some examples mainly from Cape Town this evening, but I will also show some connections with my previous work in Harare and also some research in Windhoek in Namibia. So public spaces as livelihood, inside publics, I call them. An example from Harare in Zimbabwe, where the public space merged in between inside and outside as Akram Hari mended shoes, and how this actually access onto the street was this in-between space, a transitional space. It was neither outside public space, but yet neither inside. So that's the first one. The second one being around outside publics. Many examples found in Cape Town, and this one in Khayelitsha. And then the third one around the street example in Peter Nanyemba in Havana in Windhoek, as street publics. And building on theories of people as infrastructure, informality as a mode of production, and respatializing urban informality. Public space as water. So in all three examples in which I I have worked, I have found these to be critical infrastructures. And this idea of spatializing intersectionality, where the most vulnerable often find themselves in these spaces. And in this instance, mainly children. And spaces or public spaces as gardens, where the garden merges between the yard, the front garden, the street, into the street, and beyond the street into the common territory. So this is the green infrastructure. In South Africa, it's often referred to as the green apartheid, or the unequal green infrastructure. And then spaces as walkways. All three conditions experience environments in where people have access and movement. And these have different levels of hierarchies in which I consider to be street justice. So now I'm going to move to the context of Gugulethu in Cape Town to show how some of these different spaces are expanded. So Gugulethu lands itself almost central to the Southeast Metro, as approximately 25 kilometers from the CBD. In Gugulethu, there is a north and there is a south. Most of my work has been in the south of Gugulethu. Over the last 5 years, we have been conducting studio work with students here at the University of Cape Town through urban walks and urban talks. And here we explore different ways through different local agents. In particular, I would like to make mention of Kolile and Zoe, who's been a fundamental local agent in us understanding this local context and exploring through different means to reach urban design solutions. And then secondly, ways of disrupting. How do we use this local information and work with local agents to actually fully understand design solutions, design scenarios that are relevant to a context such as Gugulethu. So in looking at livelihoods over these years, we have been mapping, and even before that, I make reference to my practice within violence prevention through urban upgrading nonprofit company here in Cape Town, where we worked with students to actually map specific kinds of livelihood in the informal settlement of Lotus Park. This expanded over the last 5 years to actually fully understand different types of livelihoods across Gugulethu. Then in terms of food security, this is understanding the different school gardens, community gardens, and areas in where people are growing individual houses, gardens, I mean. Important to this was an individual called Mama Namonde, whose garden was right opposite the local heart of the area. But unfortunately, within COVID, she no longer is in operations. But these studies of these gardens were really important to fully understand how could we actually create a growing Gugulethu, a green Gugulethu. In 2021, we tapped into Wawa Siyengo and his wisdom in 2021 around the gardening and the individual gardening that's going on both inside the yard and outside the yard. And then moving to education. So this was fundamental in terms of mapping early childhood development centers and how actually those spaces become core safe havens for young children. But not only do they function during school hours, they actually function way beyond the school hours. So after school programs and in different environments in which the children can occupy these spaces, even into the evening time as their parents come home from work quite late. With the VPUU program, we were involved in creating a toy library at Lotus Park Informal Settlement, and then expanding that into an early childhood development center, looking onto a key public space. So how can these facilities around education, gardening, water, livelihoods all come together, and then they somehow start to kind of intersect at these spaces to create safe spaces for children? And then lastly, the safe walkways, in which is probably part of my more current work and research work that we have been conducting since 2021. I'll explain the beginnings of this work in a case study called the Itemba Walkway. But this has expanded over the last 4 years through a deeper sense of mapping and map making with community members. So deeply ingrained into this idea of co-design and how do we actually understand the local context, but how do we also envisage beyond that? So this project has expanded, and so far I showed 20 examples of walkways that we have found, but there are more than this, not only in Gugulethu, but beyond into different neighbourhoods of Langa and Khayelitsha, and where community members have contacted us to try and understand how can these very small little public spaces actually be revitalized into safe access ways. These can be considered color spaces. That's what they've been referred to, spaces full of color. And this links into my previous slide where we were talking about the gray space and access around water points, with also the green space of the Gugulethu, the Lotus River Canal, that is also part of a bigger livable urban waterways project with the city of Cape Town. So the coming together of the walkway project, the Lotus River Canal, and the Itemba Walkway are all around public space, but maybe not public space in the more conventional terms. These are spaces in which have become public and spaces of gathering. So now I move to my first case study, which is called Itemba Walkway in Gugulethu. This is a small little passageway that separates two streets. It is only 50 meters long and 6 meters wide. But when Cornelia and Zoe first came across this space in 2021, we were running virtual urban walks and urban talks with the students back in the studio during a COVID landscape. This was the condition. And to quote Cornelia's words, an environmental injustice of what was happening. So during this time in which these very small leftover spaces had been occupied and full of rubbish and also incredible extreme crime and violence happening in these spaces. Through a series of quite detailed co-design experiences, and our first one starting in November 2021, where we set up different activities in this space after a community cleanup. That was probably the most important part. In April 2021, the community got together and cleaned up the space with the help of various participants and members. In November 2021, we ran our first co-design workshop. But what was really exciting was that the space created a space of joy, of happiness, of laughter. The children came. They saw what we were doing. We activated different ways of understanding what the problem was. So what were the challenges of the space? We then tried to understand what is the future quite quickly. What are some solutions for changing this space? And key to that was this understanding of running activities, so activating the space. How can we activate this space through different mechanisms? Of course, that had to be resource efficient and relevant to the context. And also, how can we start changing the space and transforming the space into a safe space? Through different experiences in 2022 with our partners, through various different partners with Africa Unite, we ran a Sustainable Development Goals workshop, again, through different activations, but with a focus on recycling and how do we deal with waste in public spaces. More recently in 2024, having a gender-based violence initiative running through different activities as well, and theatre and street theatre in this space that allowed a new way of thinking of safety in public space. So through this whole idea of co-designing, co-producing, co-activating, we ended up creating a timeline that was a small little design build project with students through from 2023 and 2024 with different community members, and actually activating the space and creating a living time frame that spanned over 100 years, particularly going back to 1950, or more importantly, as the community told me, 1948, with the change in the development of Gugulethu and the Group Areas Act in 1950, and then going forward to 2050, so that idea of forward thinking of what that meant. In 2024, we also installed some solar lights, making this space very different by night, but along with Christmas lights during the festive season, which allowed a very different approach to public space than had happened before. And this was the scene last year when we ran our design builds. It's a space that is constantly active. It runs through to a primary school on the other side and a local residential street on the other side. Also with wall art, using street art as a particular way of attracting an educational basis of what that means. Important on the one side by the primary school is a little spaza shop that sells sort of little goods. So always active. And this has expanded into working with 24 of these walkways now in Gugulethu. So we ran an exchange workshop this year in where we brought different representatives from different walkways together to discuss solutions and options for change, but also highlighting particular points where they also feel were problematic. And that's why the walkways were becoming filled with rubbish and rubble and crime. So the second case study that I'm going to move on to is what is considered the hard court in an area called Lotus Park. This is through the work of violence prevention through urban upgrading, nonprofit company. And I think this is a space in which the scale is different to the little walkway, but I think a space in which constantly is changing. So this idea that we develop one space in a time is kind of something that I think is potentially not relevant for the context because it constantly changes. So I've been mapping this space over a series of years to try and understand the different dynamics. But we first started working here in 2010. In 2012, through co-design workshops with the community, this was a sketch I drew within a meeting to try and actually fully understand how do we look at this and what does it mean to the needs and the demands of the environment, but also the community. So key to that was developing a neighborhood center for the community. But this was the space before in which there was children, there were goats, there was rubbish, there was a recycling center. So in 2014, after even building the neighborhood center, so we were doing things a little bit backwards here, where we built the building first and then sort of building the space in between. But with some funding, we managed to actually start changing that space and implementing what is considered the hard court. This also came with this idea of with working with the community in saying, kind of what are the needs if we do a public space? What are the needs? And the first thing everybody said was, we've got to have soccer, we've got to have a five-a-side soccer, and that's what it is. But in more detailed discussions, and obviously this took a while to unravel, in realizing that there was more than just soccer going on in the area. So what we decided to do was put lines for soccer, netball, and basketball. And that those were probably the most important decisions that we did make in that moment, because by the time in 2016, when we managed to put up some lights, the netball girls had managed to run a league from this space, and the lights enabled us to go on much further into night, making a gateway to the neighborhood, but a safe gateway that was also activated at different spaces. And all it really required was a surface, some edging, some lights. We also managed to plant, we were donated some trees from the local municipality, in which I have been watching them grow over the last sort of 15 years. But that in itself, a tree, you're looking at 100 years. So this idea that it also, there's slow change, but there's also fast impact. So the mix between those becomes very important. When we opened the Early Childhood Development Center, which actually sits adjacent to the neighborhood center, right at the edge of the hard court in 2018, we were met by a protest, and the space became a very different nature in which this area is. So this idea that public spaces are just for one thing also changes the way in which we see public space, and how that this can allow different activities and environments to come within that environment. The next project I'm going to talk about is called Intonjeni, again from the Violence Prevention Through Urban Upgrading project. And this is located in Khayelitsha. So I'm moving out of Gugulethu for a bit. And Khayelitsha is located, this Monwabisi Park, the settlement, is actually located on the southern portion of Khayelitsha. The little space that you can see within the white box is a little public space, and Intonjeni translate as sort of the place of the water fountain. And how did we come about this? We ran quite a few workshops, co-design workshops, and trying to understand what were the biggest problems for the educators and the carers working in this area. So the little creches or the daycares. And there were two things. The first one was access to education and health, so long-term benefits and a start in life for children. And the second was around safety for children. So a bigger issue around crime prevention, but also around pedestrian safety. So this project took us on a series of investigation and a lot of exploring with the local community, the local leaders, a lot of women who were involved in childminding. And what we realized is, of course, that the water points is where the points of congregation, and also where children meet, and were also landmarks for these children in their daily activities. We didn't implement anything at first. So again, we're doing things a little bit backwards here. We actually ran a program around early childhood development, so learning in public space. And these children were working with a community-based organization, Sekule Sonke. We enabled learning in a different way, in which materials were brought into the site, and children could play with different tools and mechanisms, and just observing how this was happening in the space, whilst still the water point is still functioning as a space. We then set up a small group, a community group of local workers, called the Intonjeni team, who were then instrumental in upgrading not only this little Intonjeni called CO4, but also a whole series of other small public spaces to create a network of public spaces across the informal settlements. Some of them we managed to link via walkways. Some of them were a complete disaster, that they didn't work. Or they were in low points and they collected water. But mainly this idea of actually upgrading these small spaces around the water points was something that could then have ownership from the community, but also allow a different activation of these spaces. Of the weekends, they were used as vaccination points. They've been used as spaza shops and tuck shops, and shebeens or taverns have also set up around these spaces. So becoming different kind of landmarks in an informal settlement environment. In 2018, we did a student project in this area, trying to fully understand the impact of that 10-year sort of process of the Ntongeni and what that meant for that space. And I think my last example here that I'll spend a bit of time on is a project that we ran in Windhoek in Namibia as part of an international urban design workshop in 2023. In developing what is a very similar to concept to an Ntongeni and a focus around water points. So in this settlement called Pieter Nyanyembo in Havana, in the northern part of Windhoek, similar conditions where water points have this kind of crossover between an underground network and an overground network where services are supplied, but how people activate them and use them becomes a very different way of how you look at the public space and what are the demands and the needs. And most importantly, how do we deal with water in public space that it doesn't become a problem and water actually then is seen as a resource. So I give particular reference to this group of people that were called Team Dwelling. So although they were looking at the dwelling scale, so we crossed over between different scales, this particular group worked from the dwelling out. So how that dwelling then associated to the public space, the small public space in front of it, the transition phase from the personal domain into a space in which could be more around the street, but also where you could sell your goods, then into secondary networks, combining with primary networks, and the kind of the composite arrangement of how one would understand the public space in this area. So they came up with a typology that I still think holds value for working in an informal settlement, where they worked through different aspects like a toolkit around tree planting, using gabion walls or recycled, and mainly using lighting as a guide. And then sort of working on a different typology around nightlife and how can nightlife around these little courtyards, the afdaki, allow for a mixed-use courtyard, but still allow for that private environment. The bigger sort of semi-private residential courtyards that connect in with the pedestrian network, the river environment. So similar to the conditions that we experience in Gugulethu with the river, this need for upgrading of the natural waterways into resilient spaces that can actually deal with what they are meant to deal with in terms of water flooding, but also not become leftover dumping spaces in which become the backyards all the time and out of sight, out of mind. So the combination of that and then these small water points or anchor points, the ame, that became very important for this kind of the typology of spaces that one sees. This group then put together a public space toolkit in which one could start seeing these elements coming together. And a lot of these elements, they can be seen in all the different spaces, and some of them are expanded more that in others, particularly around the water points, for example, where you need lighting by night to be able to go and collect water. So that was sort of where that project, so it was just a research project, but the idea is that the application of the study into into reality becomes really important in terms of scenario planning and forward thinking around public space. So I have some takeaways that I would like to go through. And I think that these takeaways are also built on sort of working across scales. So moving between the city scale to the precinct scale, right down to the street and the public space. But I think also working in an interdisciplinary nature, and then also working through participatory action research that builds on how do we actually look at public space in the global south, knowing that we're landed in a southern practice and that where resources are incredibly tight, and in many of these areas, they are so peripheral, they're not even on the agenda or on a municipal radar for budget allocation. So the first takeaway that I give to you is that unusual is the new normal for public space. And this actually starts requiring different mechanisms for governance, partnerships, and financing. So I saw this most importantly in our Itemba Walkway project, where coming together with different partners to be able to clean up the walkway on a regular basis. So we're working with not necessarily the big waste department in the municipality, but we're working with the people who collect the waste on the ground in the delivery trucks, and the very successful kind of relationship between how do you understand sort of a role of a municipality and how do you understand the role of a community, because of course it's not up to only the community to be able to deliver or clean up. It's a kind of a combination, and that partnership has different levels of what that means. But so does financing. And financing, how do we create innovative ways of dealing with finances for public space development, when public space is probably seen more as a luxury than it is as a necessity. So that is the first takeaway. The second takeaway is around legislative trade-offs, so the underground networks. What do we trade and why are we trading those? So it takes that different approach to urban design where you may not necessarily build first and then activate. You activate and then you see what happens and then you build and then you expand. So it's far more incremental than a product stage build. But this also questions regulations, which often I feel need a radical review on how we actually understand these public spaces to actually allow incremental interventions to happen. The third takeaway is around the green and the grey. And how do we allow this as a systems approach? And how do we treat these as critical infrastructures in our environments? And where the blue and the green are both respected for what they need to be and are actually at the forefront and the foreground of our urban neighborhoods, rather than stuck behind where they become dumping grounds and dangerous spaces. The fourth one is people have capacity. And that idea of co-production and responsible participation, not only between community members, but way beyond that, with partners, with students, with academics, with researchers, where we can actually build change and transformation, and albeit slow. But that also comes around with that idea of trust building, but it also means you've got to show up. And to show up, that means a certain kind of consistency. In other words, when the project ends, you have to keep going back. You can't just end at one stage. Act and be creative, number 5. So how can we be practical, strategic, and how do we create transformative projects? Transformative projects, small in scale, but big on impact. Then the 6th one is to remember the invisible forces. So these social functions of land, or this everyday culture that I show in this image of these 2 gentlemen sitting playing a game of checkers in the main walkway through Peter Nyanyemba in Windhoek. That idea of how do we allow for that spontaneity? How can we enable people to feel safe in those spaces, particularly for women and for youth. And then lastly, number 7, which is around being smart, but smart in the sense that responds to context, and smart in terms of what technology is available in an everyday environment. And I'm not talking about big smart solutions. We're talking about how do we monitor and engage in public space in an informal settlement? How do we allow a very basic app to monitor water tap breakages? Or how do we understand when a light bulb breaks that it needs to be fixed? So that idea of using the solar lights in a timber walkway has been an instrumental part of how we have started understanding that space by night. So those spaces that we often see during the day that are clean and crisp and slick actually need to be understood in the darkest moment and the darkest hour, when those are the most vulnerable spaces too. So how do we do that? And I suppose that is also about being smart and strategic in how we look at public space and what that means. So those are my 7 takeaways from the case studies, and also in understanding this idea of southern spaces that are public. And with that, I take the opportunity to thank you for listening, and also welcome you to contact me as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. It was very interesting, and also the way you are describing such contexts, which are, quite different from northern or western context. And it is important that we also consider the opportunity to learn from those contexts. And in fact, while you were presenting, I was asking myself, about the process that you have to, organize, manage, also not just for the development of the project, but also for the engagement, which I think it should be quite complex, because you actually get in touch with the locals and you talk with the locals, and you try to that's what I got from your presentation, that you convince them to intervene in the public areas and to work for upgrading those areas, since these areas can later on become public areas for their everyday activities. So because you also engage them in the making of those spaces. Yes. So I was thinking, this process can be quite challenging, especially in those kind of contexts where there is not such an established idea, of what the public space can enable in terms of opportunities.
No, I mean, I appreciate your comment, because I think a lot of these public spaces are around the process. And I think that each and every one is unique, but they have some commonalities around the ideas of livelihood, or the idea of safety, or idea of water. So those are very strong anchor points in which one can work with. And I think a lot of what the process entails is listening, and that actually sometimes requires you as the professional to step back, and actually try and fully understand that before you come, because we always have this tendency to want to go in and solve the problem. But often that problem is not going to work in an environment in which, people use on an everyday basis. So those kind of ways of engaging and co-designing and co-producing and then co-managing or co-stewardship with communities becomes very important. But it's not just around communities. And I think that that's a strategic point. It's around a group of stakeholders. So there are stakeholders who come and they have different responsibilities. And sometimes you're invited to the space. And that makes it much easier than when you come and you say, this is the space that we're going to change. So that also that relationship between also in certain public spaces where public spaces just sort of they themselves are already something before you just have to make sure that you sort of you care and facilitate it in a way that makes sense.
Yes. Well, congratulations for these efforts because it's really challenging, but I also see very rewarding from the results that you are showing. And so the second question is, do you monitor those public spaces? So what you completed, for example, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, do they continue to live as public spaces, or maybe they are changed, or maybe appropriated in a different way, or maybe completely transformed, or maybe no longer exist as public spaces?
Yeah, no, I think all of that. So I refer to them as fractional spaces because they're fractions, and sometimes the half and the half make the whole. But yes, they come and go, and some of them are successful in terms of that they become cared for and they become proper sort of spaces in which are safe. But some of them don't. The projects in the Violence Prevention through Urban Upgrading program, we ran that over 8 years. That particular program, but those spaces are still continuing, and the organization still continues to kind of make sure the taps run. And so but the Little Itemba Walkway project is something that I've been constantly going back, but I think the stakeholders within that project keep me well updated on what's happening. So we have a little WhatsApp group, and I think that that's been incredibly informative for me to actually fully understand what so I don't have to be there all the time. But very quick, that's where I was talking about smart technology, is what are quick mechanisms that we could, we can communicate. So somebody says, no, the light's gone down, so then quickly somebody else will report it, or, who dumped the rubbish? Then there's an uproar on the group. So through those kind of mechanisms, become ways of monitoring. Obviously, there's far more sophisticated. BPUU had a whole, they have an app that they use that monitors, and they go around all the spaces. And then some of the other spaces, which are gateway spaces, are just, they're constantly evolving and changing, and all the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's public space. So we don't expect that they will be like static environments. So we accept the dynamics of spaces that will also change what we thought at the very beginning. So, and in fact, what you said, to step back and to listen is exactly what public space requires, for others to also understand, appreciate, appropriate, change, modify what they believe is their space of everyday life. So not something fixed, but something that is permanently moving, in something different in terms of intangible meanings, but also in terms of physical transformation.
Yeah.
Well, now I would like to invite Via on stage, since we are opening now the Q&A session with the audience. Via was monitoring the different platforms where all our we were streaming the lecture. So Via, can you tell us more about who is watching this lecture?
Well, yes, I have to say I'm quite happy to see that we still have a decent number of viewers despite our last minute change of links. So that's always great to see, and of course, very international audience. So that's happy to see that as well. And of course, just a reminder for those that are joining late, because I see that there are more people now than in the beginning. If you did miss the beginning or any part of the lecture, you can always rewatch this and all the other keynotes on our YouTube channel later. But then I'll move on to questions, because we do have some, and I have many, because it was really, really informative lecture, and it made me reflect also upon a lot of questions related to my own PhD research. But I'll start with the question from the audience. Let me share this. So this is from Gabi, and she is asking about the finances, because of course, I imagine that this topic specifically, as the examples that you were talking about, Kathryn, they were mostly in informal contexts that are known to be a bit neglected by the local governments. So Gabby asks, who funds these workshops, and how do we ensure that the government invests in such types of activities? And are there budgets that are allocated at this local level?
Thanks, Gabby, for your question. I think finances is always a tricky one, not only for workshops, but also for implementation tasks. So I like to always reflect on my current project, the Atemba Walkway, where budgets were minimal, to the extent that a community member on the street donated 200 Rand, so that's $10 so we could access electricity for the day, we could run music, we could use the electricity for drills and equipment, and so right down to kind of micro scale financing to very small research funding, but then also kind of going and presenting it to the mayor of City of Cape Town and saying, right, this is a project and we've got to do something about it, and being able to get onto a livable urban waterways project, which is much bigger than what we are. And that has allocated budget to it. So I think the City of Cape Town are very proactive in actually including participatory design within their projects. But a lot of these projects are falling off the radar. In terms of some of the other projects, it's never kind of the designer working in isolation. It's always working with a community facilitator, or in much more interdisciplinary teams. But the budget is always allocated in a project for participation and for any workshops, and that comes with like funding food and pencils and paper and toilet rolls and all sorts of things that you never ever think you're going to actually have to think about. So there definitely has to be funding allocated for that, because if you can't actually run a workshop, and that's not even considering a technical support, you'll never be able to work in a co-design way, and you'll never be able to do public spaces in an informal area unless you actually work with a group of stakeholders. Yeah. I haven't answered the question per se, but it's far more complicated.
Yes, we know that finance for public space is the big issue that we have to face. Also in Italy, in Europe, there is not so much, available for public space development. I think it is important that we start pushing more local governments and public authorities, especially because public space is included in Sustainable Development Goals,
Exactly.
and in particular the goal 11. And so there is a target and indicator defined for public space. So if we are still trying to apply these goals and potentially also show the impact, local governments are in charge of those developments and to show results and best practices. I think at some point in 2030, someone will ask local governments, what did you do in regard of SDG 11.7 related to public space? And so I think, especially after COVID, now there is a different sensitivity, I would say, a little bit more than in the past, and especially for regeneration of urban areas, small or large. The key concept that is always, part of the conversation is how do we implement public space strategies, which is not purely the design, but it is about the process, as you were explaining, Kathryn. So how do we strategically apply a concept that is taking into account the public space? So
Yeah.
I think this is the challenge for everyone.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that what is very interesting talking about finance and strategic topics is, of course, to show the importance of these small public spaces as opposed to large flashy projects, which might be more interesting for the local governments for their image and branding. But these small negotiated and informal spaces that you're working with, Kathryn, and I'm very curious maybe on a little bit political, but maybe even community level, political level, because I have this perception that since in the settlements or the townships, the public spaces are so few and rare and not as green as we would like to, they are also very contested, and then they become spaces of conflicting ambitions. So maybe even within the same community, people would have conflicting ideas of what these spaces should become. So I wonder, have you had to navigate, and maybe this comes together with the slide that you showed about these protests in one of the spaces, that it kind of comes together of maybe some tensions within the community themselves?
I mean, I think the biggest tension is maybe the informal settlements are they're undefined, they're undetermined, they sit on the outskirts, they potentially have been like that for 30 years with limited access to resources. However, the public spaces have been intriguing in terms of their contestations. Not necessarily, I mean, the protest that was in 2018 was mainly around service delivery to kind of, houses, rather than actually the public space or the early childhood development center that we had just built. So I think some of the contestations have potentially been more around who broke the tap, or kind of, rather than spatial occupation. I think we had a whole internal discussion as if, well, if we were creating these spaces with activities for children, why didn't we put a shelter over the top? And the response was, but then they become enclosed and then they are no longer public open spaces. So I think that the conflicts were more nuanced than potentially, or more complex than maybe sort of a bigger space can allow, that, a big protest action in front of town hall, for example. So those ideas, maybe I need to create a whole storyline of what went wrong. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Very, very intriguing. I imagine this also comes together with what Luisa was talking about monitoring and then evolving in time, that these maybe new needs then appear that were not taken account into the project. I see that we have maybe last 2 minutes, so I will squeeze in the quick last question. I'm curious about this double role, or maybe even more hats that you wear, because you work both in practice and academia. And so these projects that you work on and you make real practical impact, but you also do work with students, so teaching and learning experiences. So I wonder how the one informs the other, and how do you balance the two hats, and how do you find the sweet spot between academia's tendency to overstudy or practice tendency to maybe go fast to the solution without reflecting on on all the possibilities.
That's potentially a much bigger question than 1 minute, but I think I came from practice, from non-profit environment, and I entered into academia. So my work within the university at the moment, I work with my students in the context, in a real condition, in where we work with local agents, and we then do design build on public space with urban design students, which is like radical scale swaps. So I think that learning coming in through from practice and into academia, then I realized that you can actually have impact in academia, actually doing the work on the ground, and it's not just about being sitting in a building. It's actually about really engaging with the reality of the condition, and particularly in our southern context, in which it's just down the way. So the necessity and the urgency that we need to actually be involved in that, I can't see them separate. So that's a quick response to a potentially longer discussion with whoever asked that.
That we should have at some point, I think, this long discussion on, how to combine theory and practice, and how theory can inform practice, and what practice can also give back to theory. Because the problem is also that sometimes the challenge is to translate theory into practice. And especially those who are in charge, that are on the ground, they search for ideas or practical suggestions or examples. I see this a lot, especially now in Italy in particular, where I'm currently developing some activities with the regional government. Practitioners, but also local authorities are always trying to understand, how the complexity which surrounds the public space can be framed in one solution here, another solution there, and how you connect everything into an overall vision that is actually shaping the public component of a city. Because, it is very important that we relate each public space to the so-called public city, open city, which is the city for everyone, for all citizens. And so especially because we are experiencing a lot of, in my opinion, alarming trends of privatization. And so we need to preserve public areas, public facilities, and public spaces from the transformation of the city that is also linked to certain interests, right? So the work that you do, Kathryn, is amazing, because I can only imagine how difficult it is, to be on the ground and to move people, and to convince local governments, and to talk with people on the street, and then report to to your university, your students. So it's really amazing. And I'm very glad that we had you for this keynote lecture. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so now while we say goodbye to Kathryn, we say also goodbye to our public space lovers, because we will be on vacation in August. So the next keynote lecture will be in September. We will inform you through our newsletter, and you can also follow us on social media for more news and updates. So see you in September. Thank you, Kathryn, again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.